Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another just fantastic session here in our Museum of Native American History Indigenuity Festival. And I can't tell you how pleased I am to introduce the next presenter, Joseph Kunkel. The topic, Power of Design, Community, Culture, and Place. Joseph is a citizen of the Northern Cheyenne Nation and is a principal at Mass Design Group, where he directs the Sustainable Native Communities Design Lab based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He is a community designer and educator focused on sustainable development practices throughout Indian country. His talk will showcase powerful examples of contemporary Native-focused projects and concepts that non-Natives can leverage for their own communities. I am really excited about this, Joseph. Welcome. I met Joseph in a program we were in together at the Hall Center at the University of Kansas. Oh my gosh, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. So we knew when we wanted to talk about and celebrate indigenuity, we had to get you as a part of this program. So thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Wildcat. And I'm excited to be joining you all this afternoon. And thank you to the Museum of Native American History for inviting me to speak. I'll start sharing my screen up once we're able to get that going, but I'm just a little bit excited about sharing some of the work, how we kind of think about the work, and kind of moving forward from there. And I'm gonna let me see. I think I have that now.
There we go.
There you go. Great. Well, I'm gonna kind of just move this around so I can see it correctly, and just kind of talk a little bit about the power of design, and so and kind of leading off with this kind of conversation of what is design and how does it relate to culture, community, and place, and really think about ways in which the work that I'm going to share are kind of case studies in community design, in engagement, and trying to really understand how do we kind of lift up these places in our work. And I like to kind of start with questions, because questions help to kind of frame the conversation, with communities, with tribes, with city leaders, with community leaders, community organizations, and just try and understand how and where we're coming from. This question that I'll kind of lead off with is kind of the relationship between these 4 images that we see, right? The image in the top left, an image of the rural. Many are probably very familiar with the image in the top right, what is now the United States capital in what is now Washington, D.C. The bottom left, Manhattan Island. And then a place in the bottom right, which is near and dear to me. Those are my homelands along the Tongue River in what is now southeastern Montana, on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And so this notion that this is Indian country, right? This is how we think about place. This is how we need to be acknowledging place. This notion of the rural. This notion of like, how do we lift up this place? This is actually an image not too far from where I'm joining you all today, the San Domingo Pueblo or Giwa Pueblo. And so this is Indian country, right? And this is also Indian country, the kind of celebrations of our cultures, our community, our peoples, our histories, and acknowledging that this is Indian country, I think is important when we start to think about the built environment, when we start to think about the natural environment. And lifting up this narrative as we think about design. As I kind of spoke to before, this is along the Tongue River on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. These are my homelands, and this is kind of where I started to kind of understand the importance of connection to place, and that connection to place really started to allow me to understand what are my values and how do I lift that up in the work that I do, the office that I'm joining you all in, that we do. this is also Indian country, right? And unfortunately, when we talk about the power of design, when we talk about community culture in place, this is probably the exact opposite of what the power of design can do, right? This is Indian country as well, right? Housing that doesn't necessarily represent community, culture, or place. It doesn't represent the kind of nuances and the complexities that we all celebrate, from the day to day. So how do we kind of connect those? This is Indian country, right? Manhattan Island, the kind of home of the Lenni Lenape. And I would also say that many of these buildings that were built by iron workers that were indigenous. And so how do we celebrate this place that is, quote unquote, the kind of financial capital of the world? Yet we don't kind of see the kind of the nativeness of this place, right? And what is now the U.S. Capitol, the home of the Piscataway peoples, who are not a federally recognized tribe. So how do we kind of lift up these narratives and lift up the kind of indigenuity of these places? And of course, this is Indian country where I'm calling you all from today, right? The land of the Oge-Poge. And I want to just kind of start with acknowledging with gratitude the Oge-Poge, the original Tewa name for Santa Fe, which means white shell water place, on whose unceded traditional territories I join you all from today. And so our office honors these people, past, present, and future, along with the many other indigenous peoples who continue to inhabit and hold sacred and steward these lands. I'm proud to call Santa Fe a home. I go back and forth between Montana and New Mexico, and I find kind of these places to be very important in terms of how we practice. And these are native lands, right? Indigenous lands, and kind of getting that narrative and understanding that narrative, I think, is really important, right? And we kind of reframe and define these terms in different ways, right? Native lands, indigenous lands. It's these connections to place. It's this connection to history that is important for us to lift up. And not forgetting that prior to Western contact, that there was approximately 20 million indigenous peoples that called North America was now North America home, right? And if we kind of fast forward to the present, we're just over 5.5 million, depending prior to this most recent census survey, and 574 federally recognized tribes, along with 300 plus reservations. And so just trying to acknowledge that we're here, we're present, and that we're kind of working and living in both urban environments, rural environments, and everything in between. And that, I think, is the start to how we think about the work, and how architecture could be a means for healing, how the built environment could be a means for healing, how we can start to think about this as a conversation that moves forward. This connection to identity, community, family, work, that is all the kind of power of place and the power of what design we think can offer as it relates to the nuances of Indian country. And so starting from this kind of narrative of how I kind of found my voice and how I've kind of split my time between Montana and kind of the Western thought, I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm trained as an architect, a planner, a designer. I've kind of gone through the kind of the Beaux-Arts schooling of kind of a traditional architectural education, which lifts up a Western Eurocentro thought. But kind of grounding, and I think that's the important of the connection to place, is grounding yourself in where you call home and how you connect to that place, and melding and lifting up those similarities between Eurocentro Western thought and indigenous thought, and how do we kind of make it our own. And I think that's important to lift up and kind of share a few projects that kind of get into that nuance, knowing that and acknowledging that I'm an outsider in any community I work in if it's not my own. So start with this question, and I'll pose some provocations and questions as we kind of go through, and feel free to kind of pose some questions or write down questions when we get into the Q&A. But so why are we here? Why am I kind of giving this kind of conversation or talk today? And to kind of be clear, this idea around architecture, and we firmly believe this, right? Architecture is never neutral. It either heals or hurts. And so our MASS's mission, which stands for a model of architecture serving society, our mission is to research, build, and advocate for a design that promotes health, justice, and human dignity. And the kind of prior image of those homes that I would say don't lift up that narrative, that are placeless, that don't reflect the culture, that don't reflect the place, are in many ways contributing to that notion around kind of hurting the communities in which these buildings are being served. And so how do we reframe that and really lift up an architecture that heals, and an architecture that kind of builds community and is kind of thinking about that as it relates to place? So on any given day, when we kind of look at the statistics, 33% of Native America is homeless, versus the national average of 12.5%. 90,000 are kind of unsheltered, and there's any kind of immediate need of 200,000 units of housing. And this is kind of our dollars in which we get to kind of build housing from the federal government through the Office of Native American Programs, right? That has kind of gone up. I think we're approaching 700 million, but still not enough when we think about it. This is kind of how it fluctuates over from time to time. It goes up and down depending on the congressional kind of allocations that Congress approves. But if we were to think about inflation and get into a little bit of nuance through NAHASDA, Native American NAHASDA, I'm blanking on the acronym now. But when NAHASDA was passed in 1995, if we were to kind of keep up with inflation, it would be around 900 million, which is basically how we kind of fund affordable housing in the United States. Basically gets allocated to each federally recognized tribe, and then they, through the Self-Determination Act, they get to allocate it and serve their populations to the best ways that they can. If we were to break up the kind of this number, right? If we were to break it up evenly, and that's not how we allocate our NAHASDA dollars, but if we were to break it up evenly amongst all 574 federally recognized tribes, we'd be about $1.15 million per tribe per year. That equates to about 2 to 3 homes. Just some quick math: 2 to 3 homes per year per tribe. And so, if we were to think about that more broader kind of conversation of getting to that critical need around 200,000 units of housing in Indian country, it'd take quite a long time, about 120 years to solve the housing crisis in Indian country. If we were to really kind of focus on just leveraging our federal dollars. So we need to kind of rethink that. And this is where I think the power of design, indigenuity, how can we kind of be rethinking how we solve for the housing crisis? How do we leverage federal funding? How do we kind of create narratives that and change the narrative around philanthropy so that philanthropic organizations and foundations can be investing in this initiative? And then how do we kind of make it more attractive for the kind of the banks of America, as the Wells Fargos, to be investing heavily into Indian country? Because it's going to take multiple strategies to solve this. There's not one silver bullet that's going to solve these issues. And I would say that we want to move towards this idea of self-determination and these notions of kind of sovereignty, and lifting up ways in which tribes and tribal leaders and tribal communities are in charge of these processes, rather than the federal government saying, here's your money, go build your 3 homes, your 5 homes, 10 homes, 20 homes per year. Because that is, when we kind of think about it, we are really, truly kind of steadfast in how we think about the built environment. Because if we don't take advantage, if we don't kind of move towards those notions around sovereignty and self-determination, we'll inevitably continue to get housing that is placeless, right? That doesn't reflect community, culture, or place. And so I'd kind of lift up this question again. The question is not, what is the cost of architecture? What is the cost of not having architecture? And because if we continue to kind of move forward in the ways that we have been historically, we'll continue to get an architecture that's placeless. And I would say that a lot of the times when we're working with communities, we look at architecture as an add, right? It's something that is a nice to have, right? Just like if you look at the options of us adding a sunroof to your car or lifting it, those are nice to haves. I'd say that architecture is not a nice to have; it's a necessity. If we were to kind of think about lifting up the notions around community, culture, and place, those necessities are so important to our communities. I mean, if you were to look at those that can afford architecture in the kind of historic sense, the one percenters, like architecture is not a question. When they build a development, when they kind of speculate on property, kind of in the kind of fee simple space, an architect is always part of the conversation. An engineer is always part of the conversation. Those professional services are always at the table. When we're working in rural communities, when we're working in Indian country with tribal leaders, architects, engineers, those professional services are not always at the table. And so how do we ensure that those resources are there? Because if we don't, again, we'll be creating communities at our places that don't reflect community, culture, or place. So I kind of went through this a little bit before around the kind of the 5.4 million, the 574 federally recognized tribes, the 200,000 unit housing gap. And so this is like the other question is we have to recognize the history. We have to recognize how we got here. Because if we don't understand how we got here, there's no way in which we're going to understand how to kind of solve for these issues that we see. And so this is a very simplified version of how we got there, right? So this is about 300 years of time. If we were to kind of think about contact, 500 plus years of time, there's kind of an immediate between 1400 and kind of present day of 300 years that got us to where we are today. But if you were to think prior to Western contact, the architecture reflected the communities in which people lived, right? If we were to think about the plains, the Southwest, the Southeast, the architecture was very much responding to culture, it was responding to climate, it was responding to the needs of the community. Just for instance, if you were to think about the Pueblo villages here in the Southwest, the kind of thickened adobe walls, super insulated adobe walls, kept units cool in the summer, right? Really hot, dry climate kept these units cool in the summer and warm in the winter, right? So when they heat up, that thermal mass allowed for that energy to be stored in these units. In a similar way, when you were to kind of think about some of the lodges in the Southeast, right, being able to kind of shade from the sun and allow cool air and airflow to kind of move through the building, right? A lot of the issues that we see today in our kind of contemporary housing in the Southwest and the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast, we have a lot of mold issues. That's because air is not moving through a lot of these units. We got that right prior to Western contact. We knew that we needed access to healthy air. We needed access to kind of to airflow and so on. So kind of just move through this timeline a little bit. When we think about, and we're going to fast forward from like the 1500s really quickly to Western contact. When we think about Dawes and Senator Dawes and the Dawes Act of kind of separating kind of tribal communities or our indigenous communities and pushing forward this narrative around individualism, right? And I would say that our and I'd kind of use my own community as an example. When we had our teepee encampments, when we had our community, there were roles that each individual played, and there were kind of roles in which we had to kind of rely on one another, right? And we kind of built community and built those communities in ways that made sure that we were acting as one. And the Dawes Act was established, it basically positioned individual families as the kind of stewards of their own future, right? You get this X amount of land and you have to cultivate it and you have to use that land to take care of your family. Kind of broke up the community system in many of the Plains communities. And so that the kind of individualism also kind of reflects this notion around capitalism, right? I'm the bearer of fruit for my family, and I need to kind of really hone in on that. And that's another way of kind of breaking down community. The 1937 Housing Act, which basically was kind of the main way of building housing that we see in Indian country, basically in many instances, was a copy paste, right? Housing that we see in the Southwest are very similar to the housing plans I see in the plains. Copy paste, copy paste, copy paste, and doesn't again reflect community culture in place. Fast forward, the Indian Relocation Act, again, kind of breaking up community, moving people apart, and so repairing this I think is important when we start to think about the built environment. 1995, the Native American Housing and Self-Determination Act, NAHAZA, was established. And I think this is starting, and prior to that, the HUD Section 184 Loan Guarantee Program I would say that a lot of people give HUD a bad rap. And that's fair, I would say. But I would say that HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has kind of acknowledged wrongdoings, while very slowly they've acknowledged it, but they're moving in the right direction, right? The NAHAZA being passed as a federal policy is moving and placing power back into the tribal communities so that they can build their housing. And then we have to kind of support NAHAZA and support those dollars with capacity, right? What does it mean to be owning your own home? What does it mean to be building your own housing? How are you kind of thinking about construction management? How are you thinking about acquiring contractors? When we think about self-determination, that is kind of all embedded in that act of self-determination. And not act as policy, but act as kind of doing. And I think this idea of continuing to move forward with the Hearth Act, or the Helping Expedite and Advance Responsible Tribal Home Ownership, is also a means to move forward, moving that kind of idea around the BIA, or Bureau of Indian Affairs, as kind of a land lease holder or a real estate office that is kind of in control of those land leases, turning that power over to the tribe, and so that they are in charge of their own land leases. And so this kind of movement of becoming more sovereign, becoming more self-determined, is, I would say, very recent, right? This idea of being 25 years of NAHAZA being in place, like, this is very recent in history. And so how do we kind of acknowledge that? And how do we kind of use this as a point of departure to continue to move towards self-determination? And so I'm going to kind of talk about one project in particular, the work that I kind of alluded to earlier, the work around Kiowa Pueblo, or Santo Domingo Pueblo, which is about 25 minutes south of here, of where I'm joining you all today, of Santa Fe, 25 minutes, 30 minutes south. It is along a major kind of corridor that connects New Mexico north and south. And actually, if I were to kind of stay on 25, I'd take that road all the way up to Montana, through Crow, and go up to go back home up into Montana. So that is a pretty kind of heavily trafficked road that connects basically Santa Fe down to Albuquerque. Going through Santo Domingo is also a piece of major public infrastructure, the Rail Runner, which is a heavy commuter rail that connects Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And it happens to go through almost through the village, right? The historic village. Well, back in 2012, 2013, I was fortunate enough to get an Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellowship that kind of totally redirected my professional career in a good way. I during my studies in graduate school, my whole focus was around affordable housing for my own community. And I graduated and realized really quickly that there was no way to, in professional practice, to practice affordable housing on tribal lands, right? Tribal housing authorities don't necessarily hire architects. They hire project managers, and they hire people to execute projects. But that idea around design, development, and planning wasn't something that tribes would be hiring for. And so I ended up working in a corporate architecture firm, not really enjoying what I was doing. But this fellowship allowed me to kind of redirect my professional practice, relocated me down here to the Southwest, and put me directly in the housing authority to support the housing authority in the development of new housing. And this is somewhat the story of how I find myself here today. And this is really the kind of power of design, right? When we think about design, planning, engineering, a lot of the times when projects are kind of positioned and put into action, I'd say that the opportunity for the most impact lies very early in that process, or is found very early in establishing that vision, right? So when a tribe is thinking about a housing development, when they're thinking about the critical need, the design opportunities are very high. Like, what can you do? And that's where I think architecture, planning, design, engineering offers the most impact, right? If we're able to bring in architects, designers, planners very early into the process, the potential for that project to be impactful or greatly impactful is high. The more and more the project goes through the development process, establishing of a location, establishing the finances, establishing the number of units. Once you start to kind of get those defined, the power for design to influence the process becomes smaller and smaller as time goes on, right? And then once you're getting into construction, the kind of design opportunities start to really erode in many ways. So we need to really think about, when does an architect, when does an engineer, when does a planner come into the process? And at Santo Domingo, it was very early, right? It was way before we were even thinking about any affordable housing. When I landed there, this idea of working with tribal youth, trying to understand the community, and work with them closely was my priority, right? I was an outsider, just like any other non-community member. I didn't know how to speak Karis, the local language. Many of the elders only spoke Karis. Many of the youth were kind of very fluent in their own language, and even when I was sitting in the office, in my office or at my desk, I would be hearing Karis in the hallways, which I found to be quite powerful. Like, that power of language was pretty important. And so I would kind of trade off, right? I'd leverage my design skills, transfer those design skills to the youth, and in exchange, we would be having conversations about community, about culture, about place, and just meeting with the community, trying to understand, and me as a design professional being able to read the built environment, and the community members and the youth being able to kind of talk about the significance of the built environment and what spaces meant. And so that exchange of information was really important, and trying to kind of understand that critical conversation was huge in terms of, where can design influence a process and where can it not? Here, they're learning kind of more technical programs, like simple drafting programs, or drafting programs and GIS programs to kind of map their own community, right? Being able to kind of take digital tools on traditional lands to kind of redefine how you can do it in a Santo Domingo way or a Karis way rather than a Western way. And we really quickly started to understand the potential, right? What units in the old village were uninhabited? What units were in good condition, poor condition, fair condition? Like, all this was knowledge that we were starting to generate and share amongst each other. And this is, I think, a very important kind of point to kind of rest on for a moment, right? Everything that you see, and so there's two boxes that you see, right? Or two forms, one in red, one in blue. The one in blue is the National Historic Registry boundary, established by the federal government, by the National Parks System Service, by NPS, and they defined, as an outsider, what was historic and what was not, right? Everything inside that box is historic. Everything outside that box is not historic. And as you can kind of see down here in the bottom right, this blue line is cutting through this house. And so is part of the house not historic and the other part historic? Like, who gets to define that? And this is kind of a point when we kind of think about, well, what is the role of sovereignty? What is the role of self-determination here? Who gets to decide? And as part of this survey, part of this work with the youth, was defining and trying to interpret, like, what did the community define as historic, right? And here you have one of the ditches, one of the acequias that kind of cuts through the community, right? And so this idea of leveraging and using the knowledge that is gathered by the community members, by the tribal youth, to really redefine what is historic as it relates to the community. And so using kind of Western technology, Western thought, using that in a way that really lifts up the community's voice, I think was really important in this process. And so that investment into building that knowledge became very critical. And we did that through finding some of the oldest imagery, surveying the community, talking to the community. And then as we kind of built on this knowledge, we started to realize that we were gathering a significant amount of information, right? And so how can we use that information to really prioritize and plan for the future, right? Many of the community members would be coming to the housing authority and requesting support, requesting rehab. And we saw this as an opportunity to move forward in a way that it was more proactive, where the community could actually, where the housing authority could actually be proactive in allocating those dollars and moving forward in a way that was supporting the community and not having the community to become and go ask for help. And so this idea around designing systems that were proactive, designing systems that empowered the community, really that became like one way in which the power of design was moving a process forward. And these are just some examples of just identifying and understanding what was the context of the community. And so after we did this work initially with the village, we started to realize that what we were doing as the Sustainable Native Communities Collaborative, or SNC Design Lab within MASS, was really creating a network of partnerships. We were creating those partnerships to scale outcome, to share knowledge, scale outcomes, and really, in the end, have some semblance of impact within the community, right? This idea of connecting practice to government, to academia, to philanthropy, and really understanding the roles of the tribal populations, tribal health, tribal government, tribal elders, the council, youth, and the various tribal programs. Like the ability to connect the dots here was significant. And that we saw was the power of design, right? Our ability to kind of be on the ground, document, have conversations, listen, understand the critical needs within the community allowed us to really put together a performa or program or an understanding of a housing project that would serve the population rather than just plopping housing on the ground, right? It was a housing that was serving a purpose rather than just sheltering a population. And that was the opportunity for impact, is really responding to the needs and the context of the community. And that's where we would have impact, and that's where we would have influence. And so this idea of knowing the population, knowing the audience that we're working with, knowing the community, that was what was powerful. And then because we understood that, we knew which dollars we could potentially have access to. And then leverage in either renovating, rehabbing the village, or investing in new buildings. And so as a part of this, we established these kind of primary goals, right? The community as architect of their own vision, that vision as a long-term commitment to change, and engaging with the community to gain clarity and understanding of place, and ideally participation from the entire population, from tribal youth to tribal elders and tribal leaders. This idea was that yes, we are architects, planners, designers, engineers, but the community needs to establish their own vision for what the community is, right? We will bring a set of tools, a set of processes, but working with tribal youth, some of the tribal youth, we developed surveys that were diagrammatic, that they could respond to, developing other surveys that elders could respond to, and really instilling that this vision is not a vision coming from the outside. It's not a vision that an architect from the outside is bringing to the community. It's a vision that the community is developing, and that is their commitment to long-term change, right? So because as architects, we're going to go away. I'm going to go away. I'm not a community member. And so that vision has to be instilled within the community. And the way in which we would do that is engaging with the entire community. And so this idea of designing with community to create equity, equality, and positive social change became important, because we're not designing for. This is not it's not, we're not the federal government, and we're here to help. This is in many ways, how do we work with you all to establish these notions of change? And that became really important on how we thought about this place, because that would allow us to define what is possible, right? The ability to kind of work with the community, understand the importance and the impacts here, and then use these processes to kind of move forward in a way that really lifts up the community rather than an outsider. So this notion of leveraging the past, right? This place has a history, it has a culture, it has a context. This is the village. This is an aerial image taken in the late 70s, early 80s. That really kind of speaks to the form, to the urban fabric. Like, this is very much an urban place, right? There's bones here. There's a history here that reckons any urban space, right? There's plazas, there's gathering places, there's streets. This is a form that was established well before the New Yorks and the San Franciscos and the LAs. Like, this is a form that is here and will be here way after our time on this earth. And so how do we kind of draw inspiration? How do we draw and learn from this place? But we also have to think about the future. We're not going to copy paste this place, right? We have to learn from it. And then we have to kind of establish a way of thinking about the future. If we were to the kind of worst thing we could have probably have done is just say, this is a beautiful place, let's remake it somewhere else. Like, that's not what we want to be doing. We want to learn from it and then abstract from it ways to kind of think about the future. And so this notion of creating community, creating attached programming, attached buildings to kind of create very similar spaces that people can live in, work in, play in, and gather in became really important. The plaza, the center space, is a very kind of sacred space, and you can't recreate that. And so we need to do it. We need to kind of think about new development differently. But we know the detached house on a quarter-acre lot is not that. And so this idea around listening to community, listening to Robert Tenario, who is kind of a very well-known potter in this place, we learned that 75% of the community members relied on the arts as a main source of income. They relied on making. They were jewelers, silversmiths, potters. They made food. They sold food. And so as people working in the community to kind of design housing, we had to listen to them to kind of understand how they use their home, how they use their house. Historically, that hasn't been done, right? They were just like, does a 2 or 3 bedroom house work for you? Here you go. Well, no, that might work, but you're not really listening to the needs of us. And through this process, we started to learn that they were making in their kitchen, on their kitchen table, or they were grinding in the living room, grinding shells in the living room. And that kind of started to kind of propose us to ask more questions. Well, if you're grinding shells in the living room or the kitchen, are you doing it in confined space? No, that particulate was getting ground up and going into the air. And that inevitably would contribute to bad indoor air quality, which would then contribute to respiratory issues to the youth and to the elders, those most susceptible. And we know this, this is what we were learning back in 2013, 2014. But we know that's a huge issue as it relates to today and COVID and the spread of COVID in close quarters, right? If you have multiple generations living under one roof, the potential for whatever is going on in that house to impact the entire family is pretty important to give attention to. So that's what we did as designers. We were doing our due diligence in many ways as professionals. And so what we ended up learning is that, we need to build places for them to make as associated with the with the housing development, with this potential for a new housing development. And so what would we do? What was the solution? And so what we ended up doing is designing a new housing development that did have gathering spaces that were connected to each other, but also kind of lifted up the kind of creative forms that the creative practices that they were leveraging. And so this idea of every unit having an art studio or having a making place became essential to the success of this project, right? And I alluded to that rail runner early on in this conversation. Well, that rail runner runs adjacent to what we were proposing as a new housing development, right? And adjacent to that rail runner was the trading post that at the time was just received a $2.5 million or $2 million economic development administration grant to renovate. And so you had all the components in this area of what make up community. You had affordable housing, you had a community center, you had a place for sale, you had public infrastructure or transportation that would connect the community to Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And so what we kind of were framing this as was a rural transit-oriented development, a way in which this bottom right unit, which was maybe a 5-minute walk to the rail runner, they could make in their little studio, hop on the rail runner and access the art markets in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, access the Santa Fe Indian School, access University of New Mexico. And so how are we kind of thinking holistically about what we can do in terms of community planning, community development, housing, affordable housing, and so on. And so every one of these units has associated with it a little art studio or art shed, as we were kind of coining it. And these are just some of the images right after construction. And so 1, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units, 1 and 2 stories, all have this kind of shed that is connected to light and air and electricity. As you can kind of see, the rain barrels collecting water. And so thinking about sustainability, the importance of sustainability, the importance of water collection in such an arid and dry climate, and housing that is kind of close to each other, right? It's not this one house on an acreage that really separates community. It's meant to bring community together. And a 3,000 square foot community center, right? This community center that would host gatherings, celebrations, when people pass on, to celebrate one individual's life, their lives, a place for a daycare, a place to access computers, and a community kitchen where you could kind of serve large community functions. And so this idea of creating these spaces, and of course here you have one of the artisans kind of grinding hishi. And this idea of you can kind of see that they're using pretty significant machinery to grind down those shells. And he's wearing a mask, and he would probably be wearing a mask if he were grinding in the living room, but would anybody else surrounding him? And so that idea of like, how do we design for them and ensure that the housing that we're designing reflects the cultural nuances of this particular community, which was important. And that's in many ways the power of design, like the power of the process to lift up community and culture in place was significant. So I'll kind of end on a question as I started. And so why are we here today? Why are you all here? And I just kind of place this kind of question, why am I here? And for me, I'm really kind of thinking of it as this idea of the future, right? Inevitably, it's this generation, our tribal youth, that are going to be here tomorrow, and their kids and their grandkids that are going to be the future tribal leaders. And so, how can we ensure that the built environments that we're designing today, that we're building today, can ensure the kind of transition and the sustaining of culture, the sustaining of place, and really thinking about the context in which we're living and that we're being. And so I'll kind of end it there. So thank you.
All right. Oh, really great presentation, Joseph. Thanks a lot. One of the things that I love about your presentation, and I'm sitting here and just a lot of things going through my mind, but I think you did a real good job of covering the way the whole social political, and I'll use the term government kind of landscape is changing relative to housing on our lands and in our communities. Because I think for a long time, people, thought, well, it's inevitable. If you get an Indian home, it's going to be a HUD home. And I think you did a good job of saying, well, that may have been the case, but that is changing now. And I think that's so critical, that we get an understanding that, things are changing. And so now what are the opportunities to do something different, to go back and look at our own tradition? So I really love the emphasis you placed on community. And I also like the fact that you said, this isn't a cookie cutter kind of thing, that you don't take this project and then lay it over at Oneida, or take Oneida and something successful and lay it on Cherokee lands. And I think that's the key. So I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about, so when you looking at all these kinds of values, community, vision, engagement, participation, how significant do you see it as an expression of the peoples you've worked with, of this kind of notion of their identity with that particular landscape in place?
Yeah, well, so much embedded in there. When you think about identity, and I think there's a lot. I mean, I think there's a genuine connection to place. There's a genuine connection to our families, and I think there is also a struggle with identity, and
Right.
This kind of question of identity, I think, is for individuals to define on their own. I mean, this is a question, and
Right.
that I didn't go to much of my schooling on my own reservation. I went middle school, high school on the East Coast, and undergrad and graduate school up and down the East Coast. And so that disconnection also established my notion of identity, but connecting back to my home and my connecting to place established my notion of identity about who am I as a Northern Cheyenne.
Right.
And dealing with some of that historic trauma, I think, is important, and that allows for individuals to really start to move towards this sense of, what does it mean for me to create a home? What does it mean for me to create a sense of place? That is all, I think, really important, and is core in what I think we're trying to do as a means to kind of create an architecture for healing, or a built environment that actually heals.
Yeah, I really love that. This theme ran throughout your presentation. At least this is what I heard you saying. The old model that we're building houses is that's kind of the production line view of what this issue is. And I loved it. You said, cost isn't the right question. Cost is not the question. It's really about that strengthening of community, health, and justice. And I was thinking that, again, this is really interesting because, my mentor and dear friend, Vine Deloria Jr. used to say, you can summarize American Indian metaphysics and worldviews with one key principle: power plus place equals personality. And I think, I really admire your work, because your architecture is that personality. It's like the power of those places, those relationships that are there between the land, the air, the water, the humans. All of that is the power defined by that unique place. And then your job is to say, well, how do we create these homes so that people can really live life well? And I love that.
Exactly. No. Yeah. I mean, that's a great observation. Thank you for that.
Well, I didn't think I misheard you. we're going to have to wrap this up. We're getting ready to start the next section, but we're going to have, this will be posted, probably not in the next day or two, but eventually be posted. So I know I'll be advising a lot of my friends to take a look at this session. So anyway, thanks a lot very much, Joe. And until next time, okay?
Yeah, until next time. I look forward to meeting in person. And thank you, Dr. Wildcat. Thank you, Museum for Native American History. So we'll see you all very soon.
Yeah, take care, everyone.